At some point, we're hoping the Honorable David Walker will be joining us, and he'll have some thoughts around the economy and particularly how things are going with the Trump tariffs and some of the other things that are taking place and all along those lines. I know that Nick is dealing with some business things that he's got going on in his community and all along those lines. So I'm glad to be along with one of the founders of the network, Kim Calhoun, helping in this particular show. And like I said, we're hoping that David will be joining us shortly. And just thinking about the thoughts of the economy, a lot of people are wondering about how the economy is impacting them directly, whether that's the price of eggs or whether that's the price of gas or whether that's a number of other prices that are out there and all along those lines. So some people are paying attention. Some people are trying to tighten their budget and all along those lines, trying to be better with their economics. But then you've got some folks that are being still kind of carefree in their spending and all in that space. So we've got a man that has definitely helped in the whole sense of being involved in Wall Street and has lived in Connecticut, but has also spent some time in the towers of power in terms of the financial world and everything like that. So he has definitely done work on Wall Street, that being none other than Peter Bennett, a longtime friend, and all along those lines. So we're going to see how he's doing in terms of being able to deal with these particular times. Because some people, and that's the first question I'm going to ask Peter, and he may have some thoughts as whether we're in a recession or not in a recession and everything like that, because different people have definitions of what a recession means to them. I know some people, if they don't have enough items in their refrigerator or if they're having a hard time dealing with their bills, then they may consider themselves in a recession, but that's probably more of a personal recession, whereas there is a time that the entire government and the entire country is in a recession. I don't think we're quite at depression level and everything, but there are some people that are speculating that we're already in a recession in the third month of the Trump administration, and some people are even putting the blame of that on the past administration and all along those lines. So one, are we in a recession? And two, do you think that that is something that is a valid concern, or do you think, like I do, that sometimes it's just people that are having their personal recessions and maybe not a national recession? So I'm not even sure what the definition of recession is, but maybe you have a better idea since you study economics and have definitely been in the finance space for decades.
Right. Well, you bring up a number of, hi, Kim. You bring up a number of points. First of all, in terms of recession, you're right. And how people feel about a recession depends on who you're talking about. There are 360 million Americans. There are people all around the world. Everybody's affected by the rapid changes that we're undergoing now in different ways. Some people, do better. Some people do worse. But the main issues really that's most interesting to me is President Trump doing the right things or the wrong things. And that's really debatable, depending on, first of all, who you are, how you're personally affected, but also in terms of the short run and the long run, because he is definitely disrupting the markets, disrupting the economy, disrupting a lot of things. Now, I would say most of the things I wish he would pay attention to me. I wrote a piece which David Walker read through. There's about 30 pages on the debt, but I keep trying to get into the White House. I can never do it, but I just won't pay attention, and neither did the senators so far I sent it to. But anyway, so in terms of disruption, the first question is it the right thing to do? And actually, I think it mostly is. And again, depending on who you are, you may not like what I have to say, if it's disrupting you. But the point is, we came into this administration in a very bad situation in terms of what David Walker always talks about, which is the debt. Now, Everybody on TV says 36 trillion. Oh, no. But David Walker said his estimate is 125 trillion. $125 trillion. How is that? Well, because we have promised almost the world, essentially, but we've promised a lot to in terms of Medicare and Social Security. It's underfunded. We don't have enough money. And what I said in my report, which a lot of people seem to miss, is that this is a fiscal cliff. This is what I said it is. Because what's going to happen is, as long as there's money in these funds, we're not in a disaster. But this is a great analogy. If you had a kid you were supporting, or you had a student who was going through college, and you were paying and he had really big student loans, and you were paying the principal and some of the interest. Well, that's great. Everything's going along fine. The student's getting through. But all of a sudden, just like, by the way, Social Security funds and Medicare funds are doing. So they're paying off the principal, some of the interest, and even the interest that the government is paying, that little part that they're not covering is already affecting the economy and disrupting it. But if you then say, okay, it's 10 years from now, roughly, 8 years, whatever, and now these funds are dry. So now the U.S. government, and by the way, world governments, which are in similar situations with unfunded healthcare, it may not be 10 years, but so then you get to a cliff, and this cliff says, boom, now the government has to account for all of this money, all the outgoing payments from Medicare and Social Security, the interest and the principal, and the interest has been compounding for another 10 years. So now we're at the fiscal cliff. The government is faced with printing massive amounts of money, unbelievable amounts of money, or they're going to have to default on Social Security and Medicare, which politically wouldn't be popular, which would leave people starving, to leave people without Medicare. So basically, they have to deal with this debt. So what are they going to do in the meantime? They have to do the following. One, as my report said, they have to use yield curve control and bring interest rates down. How are they going to do that? They can't bring interest rates down right now because of the inflation problem. So by disrupting the economy, at least getting the market flat, they can start saying, okay, let's get the Fed to lower rates. And ideally, in terms of this massive debt, you have interest rates, you have inflation higher than returns over the years, and you're monetizing the debt. Just 2 more points, and I'll open it up, and I have a lot more to say about these things, like, what's going on. But I think disrupting the economy is not that bad a thing right now. What we need is a flat market for the next, years, or, so that we can bring interest rates down as the first step. But things are changing all the time. The last thing I want to say is there's always been a debate in economics for now that does the economy follow the stock market, or does the stock market follow the economy? And nobody can answer this question. So in other words, if the stock market is booming, does that cause the economy to boom because people have more money, they're spending more money, and that causes inflation to boom? Or if the economy is doing well, does the stock market then do well, and then people have more money and they spend more money, and then inflation does well? So either way, it's a chicken or egg kind of thing, and nobody's quite figured that out. So I'll open it up to Kim and Sasha and Mark, and I'll get back to some more points.
May I just ask Peter, have you read a publication by the name A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System? It's been published by Hudson Bay Capital, and author is Stephen Mirren. Dr. Stephen Mirren is a senior strategist, and he is one economist. He's a chief economist among whom Trump listens to.
Oh.
If you will read this, you will understand when Trump is coming from, what are his economic policies, and to tell you the truth, in an ideal world, this is incredibly well-written paper, and in a perfect world, if everything could be implemented and everything would be done, in about 5 to 7 years, we will be living in a fantastic, prosperous country, if everything works fine. Now, if only 50% will work of that, that spells near calamity, at least on the capital.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is happening right now. And he is very mindful, and he's saying almost every second line, if implemented properly, if done with care, if this and that. So he prepared this paper in November of last year after the election already. So he prepared, obviously, this paper for Trump and his administration, because if you look at what's written about him is that he's Treasury. He was in Department of Treasury, and prior to Treasury, he worked as an investment professor.
So what does he say, Sasha? Like, what does he say Trump should be doing?
Everything what he's doing now, that's basically was predicted. He did not tell him
Really?
do this, do
I have to
that.
read this report. This is a fascinating report, it sounds like.
I think anyone who wants to understand where what's Trump is doing, with all due respect, you understand, Peter, that he has no independent economic mind because he's not an economist, never been. So he needs a input from such people like Dr. Marin. So this way, he may disagree with him, and he may say, "Okay, hell with your study, and I don't care about it." That was a possibility, but it didn't happen. In fact, it very closely following exactly this approach by Dr. Merritt. Now, the problem is that sometimes uh, to cure the disease, you're using a medicine which
Hmm.
is much more prohibitive. So
That's true.
you
The medicine in the short run, especially. Well, this is. I'll let you continue, but I just want to point out that this is what I said in the beginning. You have short-term and long-term goals in life. You have short-term and long-term goals. You may want to lose 1 pound in a month or whatever, but you also want to lose a lot more in a year or 10 years. So that's the question. Short-term versus long-term thinking is a big thing, and nobody can predict the long term. Go ahead, Sasha.
There is another danger that you may not even survive to a long term.
Well, that's true too. You never know.
Because the short term will kill you. And
Right.
even though you will be dying and saying, "Oh, but my grandchildren will be living a long term and they will be so
Right.
happy and prosperous." But in fact, it's a question whether it's happened or not. But there is no question that you are not going to survive to a long term. So what's happening right now, and Trump actually said it openly that there will be a lot of pain. The pain is happening right now
It
to
is.
investors or so on, and it's not going away anytime soon, except gold. If you
Yeah.
have gold,
As a footnote, so what percentage of your portfolio is gold, Sasha?
no, I have 5% in gold.
That's funny. That's where I am about too.
Yeah,
I ended Wall Street Hackers. Maybe I'll bring back. But what happened is I started looking and I don't like any of the stocks almost. Had been recommending so many. I'd been involved in some, but basically I said, you know what? Right now I like long-term treasuries because no matter what happens, I go high coupon 4.75. So I say if inflation kicks up,
There we
then
go. Hi,
there he is, David Walker. So I say,
everyone. The host of the show has arrived. He's been struggling without power, and he is
oh,
joining us all the way from his home, I guess, without power.
Right.
Wow.
I'm on my phone.
On your phone.
So I don't,
What
I
would we do without our phones today? I mean, what an investment in our society over time is the cell phones, I guess, really have bailed us out over the years. But, David, one of the things that we're talking about is the economic situation. Peter has enlightened us on some Wall Street situations, and one of the things I kind of hope that you would enlighten us for, Nick had a suggested item for you to talk about, what grade do you give Trump? But before we do that, there has been a lot of speculation and a lot of talk, I think a lot of misinformation about what really is going to happen to us with the tariffs. Why is it a good thing or a bad thing? What is the history of the tariffs? Can we kind of start a little bit with, the history of the tariffs? Why did some countries have to pay less or more? Was that a good thing? Is it still a good thing? Do we need to honor some of the tariffs that we have had? I mean, can you explain this for some people?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it and we can have an interaction. But let me start first with some economic data before we get into the
Okay, great.
okay. The latest GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2024, which is the last quarter that's available, was 2.4%. That's modest GDP growth. Inflation for February 2025, which is the latest data, 2.8%, but it's higher for food. And believe me, my wife tells me that on a recurring basis. Unemployment rate 4.1%, which is very close to full employment. Real wage growth is positive but modest at 1.2%. We still have very large trade and current account deficits. Interest rates, the Fed funds rate is 4.25 to 4.5%. And consumer sentiment is mixed. And it's mixed because more people are concerned about job security. If you're in government, you have more people concerned with job security. Normally, people in government aren't worried about job security, but given the big changes that are happening at the federal level, more people are. They're concerned also about AI, about whether and to what extent AI might end up displacing their job. They're concerned about policy uncertainty. We still have a lot of uncertainty, and obviously the market uncertainty, and I'll come back to that. And then they're concerned about tariffs, and I'll end up transitioning to that here in a second. But with regard to the markets, the S&P is down 5.7% so far this year. The Dow's only down 2%. The Nasdaq's down almost 12% this year. Markets don't like uncertainty, and we've got a lot of uncertainty right now. Now, with regard to tariffs, from a historical perspective, the United States funded most of the federal government with tariffs until the late 1800s. But then again, we didn't have an income tax on a recurring basis until the constitutional amendment, which took place in 1913, which gave the ability of the federal government to impose an income tax on a recurring basis. We had somewhat of an income tax during the Civil War, but that constitutional amendment gave a recurring basis for an income tax. And since then, that has replaced the tariffs as a major, revenue source for the federal government. Typically tariffs are used to protect critical industries. They're used to retaliate for unfair trade practices, such as, dumping at things below cost. Steel, that's been in that category. For national security reasons, where theoretically you can buy things cheaper from overseas, but for national security reasons, you need to maintain certain domestic production capacity, for those reasons, or to try to deal with trade imbalances. And we have very large trade deficits. We have very large current account deficits, and we have for a long time. And we've become increasingly reliant upon foreign lenders to be able to lend us money to finance our deficits, which is not a prudent move. There's a lot of concern about Trump's use of tariffs. From an intellectual standpoint, the Republican Party for many years is believed in free and fair trade. That idea that there would be tariffs if everybody was playing fairly and on a level playing field. Trump is very non-traditional in many different ways, and one of the ways that he's non-traditional uses tariffs as a negotiating tool in order to try to achieve a range of objectives. For example, he used the threat of additional tariffs against Canada and Mexico as a means to try to get them to do more with regard to border security and with regard to the flow of stemming the flow of not just illegal immigrants, but also of fentanyl and illegal drugs. His latest thing is focused on reciprocity, the idea that, we'd prefer not to have tariffs, but on the other hand, if Europe is going to tariff our cars at 25%, then we're going to tariff their cars at 25%, with the hope of getting those down dramatically, such that tariffs can be minimalized. Because my view is they should be temporary and targeted if you have them at all. But I will tell you that there's great uncertainty, and that's creating instability. It's creating market volatility. Significant tariffs are supposed to take place on April 2nd, which is just 2 days from now. And I think that's one of the reasons that you've got, so much concern in the markets and among consumer sentiment. So that, those are just a few preliminary thoughts to start off, but I'm anxious to hear what other people have to say. And Sasha, whether there's been any more interaction between the U.S. and Canada on this. I have not looked at the news this morning because I've been out, but that my comments are based upon last night.
David, here's my comment about using the tariffs as a negotiating tool. The problem is it's a very questionable issue whether you will be able indeed negotiate or not, or successfully negotiate or not. It's an issue. But imagine that even you are successful in your negotiations. You are most likely, in case with Canada, it's 100% obviously, that you are losing your goodwill as a reliable partner, neighbor, and you are alienating your neighbor with whom you have very substantial trade both ways. So Canada is now looking to enter the European Union, and is announced that it cannot longer rely on the United States long term. And so therefore, same thing is happening right now, situation between United States and European countries, and all this bravado about making Canada 51st state, taking over Greenland from Denmark, which is, by the way, is a NATO country, but he doesn't care about NATO either, and most likely he will leave NATO, and on a path of leaving NATO, he is relocating the American troops in Europe from Germany to where it's stationed for last, 75 years. He is relocating them to Hungary, which is the friendliest country in Europe to Russia, Putin. So this is what's happening. So it's not just a tariff itself. It's a combination of many factors that Trump is making U.S. weaker economically, politically. He's losing friends. He's creating enemies. And I'm not so sure how far he will go with that. As I said earlier, before, David, you came back, I recommended everybody to read this paper by the name, it's published by Hudson Bay Capital. The name is A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And it's prepared by Dr. PhD in economics from Harvard University, Dr. Mirren, Dr. Stephen Mirren. Without this document, you have no clue about Trump's economic policies. Dr. Mirren is the only one that Trump is listening. He's the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump, and only this paper provides understanding of what Trump is doing these days. I'll just take a few seconds just to read. It's from the very first page, from executive summary. What he's saying is, the root of economic imbalances lies in a persistent dollar overvaluation that prevents the balancing of international trade, and this overvaluation is driven by inelastic demand for reserve assets. As global GDP grows, it becomes increasingly burdensome for the United States to finance the provision of reserve assets, and the defensive umbrella as the manufacturing and tradable sectors bear the brunt of the costs. In this essay, I attempt to catalog some of the available tools for reshaping the systems, the trade-offs that accompany the use of these tools, and policy options for minimizing side effects. This is not policy advocacy, but an attempt to understand the financial market consequences of potential significant changes in trade or financial policy. This is very well written paper, very realistic, and if properly implemented, it could do a lot of good to United States and probably all over the world. The problem is, who is implementing this?
So, Sasha, I'm going to read that piece. I will look forward to it. And I'm also curious how much Trump is following it. But I have to disagree with a lot of points you had to say. First of all, the way I view it, it couldn't remain the same. Not only, as we discussed, the $125 trillion in net present value and debt, the United States, the huge trade imbalances. But I don't mean this literally, but there is an expression, with friends like this, you don't need enemies. And if the countries of the world, in Europe, for instance, refuse to support their own defenses, they spend way under what they've even promised for years. Trump in his first term got some of them to start boosting their budgets, and then he was criticized as a hater of Trump. Trump was criticized as, he hates NATO, he's going to destroy NATO, but he was trying to get them to come up to anywhere near where we spend. Now, he also, by the way, as a footnote, like some of the countries that spend it, like Poland or Hungary, where they're spending larger percentages. But you look at Germany in particular, they spend a fraction of what they should be spending and what they promised. Then they have huge surplus balances with us. So there's two scenarios here. One, they start responding and saying, okay, free and fair trade means the same rules on both sides. If you're going to tax our autos at 25%, it seems like obvious that we're going to tax yours at 25%. Or let's all trade fair, which is what everybody should be. And, I'm for free and fair trade, and pretty much everybody should be. But let's bring it down to zero. So either way, you either get reciprocity one way or the other. And that's my first point. And the second point is, you're right about the strong dollar. But, a lot of people have been manipulating that. The strength of the United States has made the dollar strong, even despite the surpluses, even despite the debt. This is why disrupting the market and causing a little chaos may not be that bad. If the dollar value goes down, as treasury rates have been recently going up, maybe that's a good thing, because the dollar maybe gets a little weaker. We don't want a weak dollar, but we have two. I guess I'm the moderator, by the way. I was not sure because I was just jumped in coincidentally for Nick, and so I guess we'll go to David and then we'll go to Sasha. David, go ahead.
Well, first, I think we have to separate national security from economic issues, although they are all interrelated. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that Europe has not been carrying their weight with regard to national security for a long time. And the truth is, the United States has borne a disproportionate burden for ensuring the security of NATO. And the truth is that the greatest threat from our standpoint is from the Pacific, and we don't have a whole lot of options out in the Pacific. And so therefore the bottom line is this: there will be, in my view, a redeployment away from Europe to the Pacific. That's going to happen. Okay.
A military redeployment to the Pacific.
Military redeployment from Europe to the Pacific, because we do have allies in the Pacific. We have Australia, we have New Zealand, we have the Philippines. Okay. But with the exception of Japan, and we have the ROC, the Republic of Korea. But the fact of the matter is that, with the exception of Japan, their economies are not nearly as large as some of the European countries. And Europeans ought to be bearing more of the burden of their own security. We should stand behind Article 5. We should remain in NATO, okay? But we should not bear a disproportionate burden, and we have been for far too long. Secondly, if you talk about the economic side, look, I just soon have zero tariffs, okay? I just soon.
Oh, who wouldn't?
Across the board.
But let's come back to the car example, because I think that's one that most people can understand, okay? We make cars, Europe makes cars, okay? A little bit more complicated with Canada because we have a lot of stuff that goes back and forth across the border, right? I mean, cars are a combination of things that come from Canada and the U.S. and some of them are assembled in Canada, some of them are assembled in the U.S.
And many in Mexico. A lot of parts come from Mexico too.
Same thing in Mexico, so it's a little bit different with regard to North America. But if you talk about the European continent, Europeans make great cars. I mean, I own a Porsche. I own a Mini Cooper. They're European cars. Okay. My wife owns a Toyota. That's obviously from Japan. We've owned American cars from time to time, but why would you impose a 25% tariff on importing U.S. cars? And we only impose, 1.5%, I think it is on.
It might be 7, but on some of the cars, but I'm not. I'd have to look
But
that
it's
up.
very low.
It's much lower, much lower.
It's much lower and everything. Just really quickly, because I had a quick question and everything kind of along the lines of what's going on with the tariffs, because we're seeing both internally and externally, because of tariffs and policies, a number of boycotts. And I'm wondering how that's going to impact our economy and impact our whole system of recovery and all along those lines. Because I've mentioned a couple of times the boycott that some people that are upset at DEI and DEI policies have launched against Target, Walmart, and some other major folks. And then I'm seeing that the French are literally boycotting or shunning McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Tesla to protest against the tariffs and everything. And we're also seeing Danish are doing that, and definitely in other countries, there are folks that are targeting Coca-Cola, Netflix, or Pringles and everything because of the tariff notion. So I'm wondering how effective, whether it's internal boycotts, such as what's going on with Target and Walmart because of DEI policy, or external boycotts are actually going to get our economy possibly to crash. And I don't want it to crash, but boycotts.
That's a great question, Mark. That's a great question. David, why don't you handle that, and then we'll get to Sasha, because I promised we'd get to him.
I want to come back to something that Sasha said. I agree wholeheartedly that these tariff and certain other actions that have occurred within the last several months have had an adverse impact on our relations with Canada and certain other countries. There's no question about that. I'm hoping that can be worked out over time. But, you can't necessarily calculate that in dollar terms, although what Mark is talking about is an example of how it can have adverse economic impacts, because people's emotions decide to say, well, I don't like, what the U.S. is doing.
Oh, it's happening. It's happening all over.
Yeah, right. And therefore I'm going to end up boycotting, then obviously that can end up hurting U.S. companies, U.S.-based companies. And that's very different than what's going on with regard to Tesla. Okay. Which is, I think, people don't like the fact that Elon Musk is aligned himself with Donald Trump, and he's the point on right sizing government. So I think that's a different situation. So, but I think I'm hoping that we can, as I said, I'll come back to what I said before. I would like to have zero tariffs, and if you're going to have tariffs, I think the concept that has the most intellectual merit is reciprocity.
So let's go to Sasha. We are definitely there. Most people are there. I think we should have, reciprocity in one form or another. But Sasha, let's get back to what David just said, and you said. Wait, let me ask the question. So the question is, Canada, just like Europe, doesn't do a lot of military spending to defend themselves. They have large surpluses with the United States. Is that fair? How is the United States supposed to deal with that? How do they solve that situation? Do they just say, oh, it's not fair, and just walk away? Or do they take some action? And what action should they take about these two inequitable situations? Oh, Sasha, you're on mute.
Okay, Sasha, hold on. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. You see, you're trying to put in one basket the issue of trade imbalance and the obligation of defense.
No, it's two questions. It's two
questions. It's not the same. It's two separate.
Absolutely. What's your answers to both of those questions?
Let's take one thing at a time. For example, forest products. U.S. is insisting that Canadians are using unfair advantages of dumping or anything like that, and therefore there is a huge imbalance in trade on forest products. Indeed, and you know why? Because in U.S. products, forest products, they belong to individual people, companies, etc. In Canada, forest is owned by Crown. So therefore, when Canadians need their forest, Crown does not charge them exorbitant rates as US charges its producers, people, companies. So therefore, inherently, the Canadian forest products will be forever more competitive on a world market than US forest products.
Let me
It's
redirect
done. It will
Sasha.
be there for the next 700 years, whether you like it or not. Okay?
Sasha, let me jump in on that briefly, but that really isn't the total like macro answer, and then maybe we'll let Rick answer after that. So for Sasha, so first of all, on forest, I believe if I was just giving you a quick answer, the United States government owns a large percentage of the land in the United States. I think it's 75% of the land is controlled, and they don't let a lot of forestry on there. So if they opened it up, which I think Trump is looking at now, like saying, let's not destroy our forest, but let's, manage it and, get resources, whether it's more oil from federal land, although they're not going to get as much as they think from that. But in terms of forests, there's all these forests. But let me get back to you for 1 minute, Sasha, and then we have some other people want to talk. So, Sasha, the macro question is, and it's two questions, you were correct on that. First of all, the military imbalance. How do we get Canada to spend more if they're just saying, well, we're going to rely on you? And how do we deal with the surpluses? Rick, you're next.
All right, so I looked up some numbers.
No, Rick, let Sasha answer and then you're up.
Yeah, so Canada currently spends 1.37%, 1.4% of its GDP on defense, and has promised to get that up to 2%, which is the target spending by 2032, 7 years from now. Then I looked at all of NATO, and Trump the first time.
And what does the United States spend, Rick, for context?
I think like 4%. I guess
3.2. 3.2.
But so Trump the first time kind of goaded a lot of NATO countries into spending more, and then Putin invading Ukraine goosed a lot more NATO countries into spending 2%. Now it looks like 2/3, 3/4 of NATO countries are spending at least 2% of their GDP, which is the target rate. Germany, the UK, France, Turkey, Poland, as you mentioned, 4%.
Germany, tell us Germany there, who's sending all these autos to us.
Germany's spending 2.1%.
Watch Germany in the next few months, and you will see how much Germany is going to spend. There's already approval of $1 billion. Okay, now coming to European countries, including Germany. So that will go into defense as well. So you will see very different number and very. Now the problem is, Peter. Just let me finish, and you can do anything.
Go ahead.
The problem is that in this paper, Dr. Miran did not suggest to do the tariffs and squabbling with other countries about their input of NATO defenses and other stuff or so on. He did not see that combined at all to make it United States a pariah in the international world. He said, okay, you do tariffs and you do it properly, and you have to weight each country and each particular product or so on. And that's what's not going to happen right now. Right now, 25% here, 10% there, and he's just going at will to intimidate other countries.
Let me say something, and then I think
that's all what's happening.
Sasha, that's a good point. Let me just throw something out there.
Yeah.
Basically, and first of all, Trump doesn't have to follow everything he said, but the more important point is, look, Trump has got a 2-year window right now, and then we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years when the elections come. If he does even half of his stuff, he might disrupt it, and maybe they'll lose the House, So I think his attitude, and I'm just guessing, is I'm getting it all done as quick as I can. I'll fix any of the problems, and hopefully, we'll keep the House. But a 2-year window in government, the way at the pace government moves, is like, you could work on this for the next 20 years. We could work on the debt for 30 years, but we're going to be bankrupt in 10 if we do nothing. Let's let David talk. I think he wanted to talk, and then maybe we'll get back to Rick.
Well, David needs to talk right now. He's David.
Yeah, okay.
David.
2 things. One, the national security issue is different than the tariff issue. Okay, and we've talked about that already. Secondly, on the tariff issue, look, I think the strongest argument Trump has on tariffs is reciprocity. All right. And so what I would like to hear, again, I've already said, I just assume we have zero tariffs, but I'd like to hear people's comments on reciprocity, because I agree that there needs to be some intellectual basis of what you're doing that makes economic sense and that also is equitable. And can be easily explained to the American people and to the people of other countries, because this is a two-way street. Trade's a two-way street, right? So my point is, what's wrong with reciprocity?
Oh, yeah. And the other part is, how do you get there, right?
I agree with that, but intellectually, what's wrong with reciprocity?
Right.
Rick had a question.
Rick, would you like to go, and then we'll let Mark? I think
I'm not talking about reciprocity. I'm going back to NATO numbers. So the trend is this: 2014, 11% of NATO countries hit 2%. 2023, 1/3 of NATO countries. 2024, 74% of NATO countries hit their 2% level. The closer they are to Russia, the more they spend. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. This is reminiscent of the 1930s in that the countries, everybody's getting a little bit, setting up for war. Nobody wants war, but it's also similar in that, a lot of propaganda floating around. Radio was new to the world. Newspapers were spreading throughout the world. Spanish flu had fucked up people's brains. We have COVID screwing up people's brains. We have a ton of social media propaganda that people aren't resistant to yet. And we have international belligerence.
That's a good point. What happens, history repeats itself, right? And it does look a little bit like what happened in the 30s. Mark, I think you want to say something, and we'll get back to David. Go ahead.
I'm going to get back to David first, and then I had a question for David.
Okay,
but David, it looks like you had a response.
Several key factors. Number one, February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time. The first time was 2014, and the West did nothing. And so you talked about the significant increase in spending as percentage of GDP. The biggest increase occurred after February of 2022. Secondly, it's very understandable.
Reality hit, right, David? It's like we can't fool around here.
Right. And it's very understandable that the countries that have the closest proximity with Russia would end up bumping their spending up even more because they're more at risk. Okay. But the U.S. has been for many years trying to get the European nations to spend more, and has been said Putin deserves the Recruiter of the Year award for NATO because the fact that his irresponsible actions, in particular invading Ukraine, has been a wake-up call for NATO. And yes, Trump has been trying to push the NATO countries to carry more of their fair share, but Putin's invasion of Ukraine has more of an impact than anything else, and it's tragic, but it's true.
Mark, and then Kim.
I just want to bring up,
ahead,
we had asked about reciprocity, and you're talking about the mutualness of trade. Why wasn't it always mutual? Why did we agree not to do mutual tariffs and
good question,
continue doing trades over the years? There was a reason, David. Why?
That's a great question. How did it develop? How did this develop over the years?
How did all of this uneven and equal?
Well, I guess the simple answer I would give, because I don't know the details, is who the hell was negotiating for us?
Right. Thank you. But why did they agree to? There had to have been a reason why they said, okay, you get this amount, you get this amount. I mean, it's kind of like the way we do our tax cuts, right? The wealthy pay too much, so we need to give them cuts. I mean,
let me give you a theory, okay? Mm-hmm. It's very understandable that there could have been an unlevel playing field after World War II
Yeah, good point.
Europe was in ashes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
When we were 50% of global GDP,
Right.
and when steps needed to be taken in order to try to be able to help Europe recover. The same thing goes for Japan.
Mhm.
The same thing goes for China, right? Those were very different times. And so you could make an argument that it made sense for us to invest in those countries, okay, in their redevelopment, for global economic growth and trade opportunities. It made sense for there to been not to have reciprocal tariff policies because they, we were it, okay, and therefore they needed help. But that's a very different situation today. That's
Mhm.
not what the
Was there ever terms put into place that we should reevaluate this? Was this in writing?
well, there are trade agreements. I mean, there are
Right.
trade agreements, that exist. In some cases, they're multilateral trade agreements. There's a multilateral trade agreement between, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. I think the bottom line is that what this is likely to do is to stimulate a renegotiation of trade agreements. And if Canada ends up joining the EU, they'll just have to be part of the negotiation.
That's true. You know what, Rick? I want to get to you, but Sasha, you've had your hand up for a while. Sasha, not too long because we're starting to run out of time already. Go ahead. What do you have to say, Sasha?
Okay. First of all, remember what makes some nations more successful and richer than others. It's the quality of their products. If German cars, Japanese cars are much better than American cars, it goes beyond any reasonable doubts. American cars just as not as good, and for many years so. Therefore, there is a demand all over the world for German and Japanese cars and no demand for American cars, except in America itself.
But Sasha, does that explain the need for unfair tariffs from one country? If their cars are better, why do they need tariffs at all?
That's a good question. I don't know why they need tariffs, but if
Okay,
they
Rick,
need
go ahead,
tariffs,
Rick.
All right, so I want to talk about a quality Russian product, but first let me talk about the White Lotus this season. Takes place in Thailand.
Not
And you
too
see
much.
all these creepy old rich guys from America moving to Thailand to get hot girlfriends.
Oh my
And
gosh.
Russia has a man shortage. That Russia's got about 145 million people. That's expected to decline to 130 million people by 2046 because of war casualties.
Right.
Which so they don't have enough men. So it's a buyer's market if you want to get,
Okay.
a mail order Russian bride.
There you go. It's a big market. David, let's go to you.
Let's go back to cars, okay? U.S. cars are a lot better than they used to be on quality, okay?
That's true.
But
they were forced to, by the way, because of the competition from Europe and Japan.
But in my opinion, okay, this is a generality. There are exceptions to what I'm going to say. In my opinion, the Germans and the Japanese in general have better quality cars than the U.S. does. There are exceptions to this. All right, so I come, and by the way, the German cars cost more money than American cars do.
Really?
All right, and so then we come back to tariffs. Why the hell is the European Union charging 25% tariffs on U.S. cars when their cars are allegedly better? And so therefore people wouldn't want to buy the U.S. cars anyway. To me, the only thing I can think of is they're trying to maintain their prices on their cars to be able to help people understand to lower the difference.
Well, yeah, that makes total sense. David, I have a different topic for the panel for the last few minutes. I talked to somebody in a pretty high position in finance yesterday, and this is just his opinion, but he was saying he thought the Chinese this year coming were going to invade Taiwan. And I thought they'd be crazy to do it, but what does anybody have any opinions on that? I mean, that would be extremely disruptive to the market, by the way, and throw the whole world into a crazy situation. But would they really risk it? He felt like he didn't see a lot of risk for them, but I think he's way off base. David?
Well, my book, American 2040, Still a Superpower, ? The first edition was written in September of 2020, and it was updated in February of 2024. And I predicted that in 2020, that China would take an action against Taiwan between 2025 and 2027.
Wow.
Could come as early as 2025 or as late as 2027, but I also believe that if China is going to take an action against Taiwan, it's likely to start with a blockade.
Yes, that's what he said, by the way. He said he thinks they're going to blockade Taiwan this year.
Yeah,
wait, I want to go to Rick in a minute, but David, isn't there incredible economic risk for them doing that? I mean, it's going to disrupt trade for them, and they have huge economic problems, and billions of poor people, 2 billion people, and a lot of them are poor. And, there's a lot of disruption in that. David and then Rick, because we are running out of time.
They've got more of a demographic problem.
They do.
Anything else. But understand that, demographics are not working in their favor.
No doubt about it.
There are lots of reasons why, if they're going to do it, keep in mind this is a priority for Xi Jinping. If they're going to do it, they're going to do it within the next several years. But I come back to what I said before. I think they're more likely to do a blockade than.
And then the next question will be, how will the United States and President Trump react? Because he doesn't like to be pushed around. Will he then, will we have a military conflict between the United States and Russia in the Pacific? Rick?
So I have a question for you guys. China absorbed Hong Kong with very little outward violence. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that now China, I feel like they're being outwardly chill. Of course, we're at cyber war with them all the time, and economic, but I feel like China is laying back and letting the U.S. and Russia be the world's buttholes, and it's just kind of trying to be the world's friend. Is there any way for China to absorb or start to merge with Taiwan without violence?
Well, his theory was that Taiwan would fold if there's a blockade, and in the absence of U.S. Right. He thought the U.S. He didn't consider the U.S., but there's going to be huge economic and the stock market's going to react. And you're talking about huge trade issues with China, and the whole thing will be so disruptive. But his theory was Taiwan will just fold because 40% of the people are already in favor of the Communist Party. That was what he said. I don't know this for a fact, but he's saying there's enough people in Taiwan and they'll just fold. That was his theory.
Comments. All right. Number one. The British had a 99-year lease for Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. 99 years expired. And so therefore, that's why it went back to China, because the lease. Okay. In the case of Taiwan, it's different. China has always claimed Taiwan. Mm-hmm. The nationalists who lost the Chinese Revolution ended up going from the mainland to Taiwan. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as a country. No other major Western nation recognizes Taiwan as a country. The United States does not have a treaty with Taiwan, defense treaty. No other major Western nation has a treaty with Taiwan. The United States prefers that there be one country, two systems, meaning, communist on the mainland and democracy in Taiwan. Taiwan is of strategic importance for several reasons, but the two biggest reasons are they produce 80+% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors. And
exactly.
one of the reasons why we're trying to increase production here, but that'll take years. Okay. Taiwan is also of strategic importance geographically because a huge percentage of global trade comes through the South China Sea. All right. But you need to understand there's a difference between what we can do, what we should do, and what we will do. And we have a policy of strategic ambiguance with Taiwan. So we always want to keep China guessing. But let me give you a scenario. Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of the United States. We don't want Cuba. I've been there, okay, more than once. But if we wanted to take Cuba, don't you think we could take Cuba? Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. And do we have capabilities? Yes, we have significant capabilities, but it's a long way from the United States.
Good point. Very good point. So, David, following up, or anybody, but 80% of semiconductors we're talking about coming out of Taiwan, which I was going to raise myself. I knew it was a large percentage. I mean, this is the future of the world in terms of where we're going. That'd be another show on AI. But the point is, then all of a sudden, China's controlling the flow of semiconductors. I mean, and again, this is all theoretical, but does the United States try to block the blockade? Do we just say we're cutting China off from all trade, which then disrupts the heck out of China because they've been, living on our surpluses, and they're not going to just make that up. Anybody?
Can I just say one thing real quickly?
Sure.
It's good to see you all. David, it's always a pleasure to hear you talk because you make so much sense. And, I wish you were the comptroller general right now, but you're a very brilliant person. With regard to tariffs, the disparity with other countries is it's unacceptable. And whether it started from magnanimous purposes or not, Trump's changing it, and he should. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Look at what Doge is doing, or look at what Doge is finding. It's just unreal the amount of waste and fraud at the government level. Now, I'll go back to the late 90s. The one president who did a great job was Bill Clinton. He's the one who balanced the budget, okay? And George W. Bush ruined it with a tax cut combined with an absolutely needless war orchestrated by one of the worst vice presidents in history. But Bill Clinton showed that it can be done if we're fiscally responsible, and I hope we get there. Thank you.
Yeah, let me mention a couple of things real quick. One, 3 things happened in 2003 that told me that Washington was out of touch and out of control from a financial and fiscal standpoint. Number one, the tax cut was supposed to pay for themselves. They didn't come close to paying for themselves. Secondly, we invaded a sovereign nation without declaring war for the purpose of toppling the government based on false pretense. Some said that it would pay for itself. It cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives and created a vacuum in the Middle East that empowered Iran and eliminated a check and balance to Iran. That was Iraq. And thirdly, Congress and the president worked together to expand Medicare to add prescription drugs. It added $8 trillion in new unfunded obligations when Medicare was already underfunded $19 trillion. And things have gotten much worse since then. And then if you can just look at the data on debt to GDP, it accelerated even further after I was Comptroller General. Thank you for your time.
And David, you're absolutely right. That's funny because when you said there were 3 things, I thought of a few more that I thought you were going to say, like the Social Security Fairness Act, and we just spend and we spend and we spend, but things have got to change. We're hitting, but again, this is.
We're hitting the top of the hour, Peter, and everything, so we got to get ready to wrap it all on those lines.
One thing. Compare Gulf War.
We're out of time right now because we're hitting the 51. Thanks, Mark. I was about to close. So
just one thing. Compare Gulf War I with an alliance of 42 countries, overwhelming force. The ground war took 4 days. We lost fewer than 300 troops. We did it right in 91. We effed it all up in 2003.
Okay, so we'll have to close. It was an exciting show. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll watch Wall Street. Watch Economics Monday next week. See you soon.
Stay healthy so you stay wealthy. Take
Right.
care.
As Jim always says, get healthy, get wealthy. We're still live, according to this.
Yeah, hit that button, the live button. In the stream. That's what she didn't do. Cool.